Hello, dear Brianna and Brandon. I hope this finds you well. I'm trying to charge my phone at the same time as talk to you, so I've got it propped up on my laptop, so if it suddenly falls over sideways, it isn't that I'm dead drunk and have finally passed out. I'll try and write it and write myself in the process if this happens. So, good, you've been reading Jonathan Swift, that modest proposal of his to cook up tender Irish flesh to feed a starving nation. It's a groundbreaking satire, shocking, still shocking, and I still find that I meet students who simply don't understand that this is intended satirically, and they think, "Oh my God, what a horrible man," or maybe they think, "Well, that's an idea." I'm not sure. However, there it is, a masterclass in how to set up a satire in terms of the use of pseudoscientific social science language, which is still with us, the way in which people surround their absurd or indeed their rational hypotheses and proposals with elaborate scientific or pseudoscientific argument. And Swift is a master of satire, largely to the extent that he has mastered that kind of discourse, as well as having the sheer bloody nerve to to conceive of the project. There is another satire of Swift's which is particularly dear to my heart, even dearer to my heart than Modest Proposal, because it's actually extremely difficult to find. And I'm going to ask you if you managed to find it somewhere, because I can never remember what it's called, and even when I Google the elements of it, which ought to quickly take me to it, if it's there online, as it is, it must be, I can't succeed. But you may do so, and it may provide hours of harmless fun to be searching for the word Swift and the word turd, which in Irish is pronounced tord. We had a lady who worked in, I'm sorry, I'm not addressing the strangeness of my asking you to Google a turd. We'll come to that. In a theatre where I worked, was actually the first theatre I worked in during a longish spell as a theatre director in my 20s. The first theatre I worked in was in Leicester, slap in the middle of England, and we had a lovely Irish lady there who served us hot coffee and sticky buns, and she had a really ripe Irish accent, and the game was to try and get her, for reasons that we had to concoct in order to succeed at the game, to get her to utter the words 43rd. In her accent, this was farty tord, and it gave us great pleasure to hear farty tord ring out across the lobby of the theatre. So tord and fart. But in the case of Jonathan Swift, it is an actual turd that he's talking about. Now, his satire involves, as you will see when you find it, if you do, and if you don't, you can still ignore the full, you can still enjoy, you can ignore it too, you can still enjoy the full absurdity and outrageousness of his project, which was, as he described it, he was walking the streets of Dublin and he was anatomizing, if that's the word I really want, the condition of the Irish inhabitants, the Hibernian inhabitants, as he would say, as you would say in those days. The Irish were Hibernians. And he would assess the state of health and finances as well of the Irish in relation to their English overlords by studying the difference between Irish turds, which were, I'm afraid, to be found in the roadway, on the sidewalk, and English. And I guess there were also some poor English there, or else some English who were, as we say in England, caught short and decided to use the sidewalk. I couldn't get home fast enough. But believe it or not, the difference in the Hibernian turd and the English turd, of course, this is complete fantasy on Swift's part, but and yet maybe not. The difference in their shape, their constitution, their color, was indicative in Swift's mind and in his exposition of his argument in this account, was indicative of the food consumed by the Irish relative to the food consumed by the Anglo-Irish, by the English, which expressed itself, as I say, not only in the color and consistency, but in the shape. And he goes at some length into the pyramid shape. I believe he also talks, as far as I remember, about the shape or the nature, the defining nature of the Irish anus. Of course, the point of this is to bring before his readers the appalling poverty in which the Irish lived. But trust it to Swift, who had more than a little obsession with the business of shitting. Trust him and him alone to bring this forward as a sociological explanation. Swift and the writer we were previously reading, Alexander Pope, were great friends. A little hard to think of either of them, these vicious satirical monsters, being close friends with anybody. But I guess, if you're two scorpions, you're more likely to be friends with each other than as a scorpion you are with most other creatures. However, their friendship was tender, and at least tender as expressed in their correspondence. And there's one extraordinarily beautiful letter. I'm sure you wouldn't be able to find it now. It was published once in an edition of 18th century prose, brought out by Penguin, or I think it was Pelican, that branch of Penguin. I can't imagine that you'd be able to find it, but if you can, it's a very beautiful letter in which Swift talks about the great sadness he feels that he's unlikely ever to see Pope again. Now, the reason for this is noteworthy because Swift wasn't going to come back to England, which he detested, had reasons to detest as an Irishman. And Pope, who could perfectly well, you might think, have gone to Dublin to visit his friend, had been told by the doctors that were he to throw up, were he to vomit, it would kill him. This absolutely implausible diagnosis, who knows why they thought this up? I mean, doctors have come up with stuff like this since the beginnings of time, and they were too afraid, Pope was, and Swift was too, they were too afraid that it might be true to take the risk of putting Pope on board a steamer crossing the Irish Sea, which would have come to Dublin, and allowed him to meet his dear friend, who Swift describes as his friendship with Pope is, it's like having a limb lost, a part of him. They certainly struck a chord in each other, both of them outcasts in their way, as a great many great writers are. It's one of the things I think that propels you towards being a writer, is to bridge that gap, or not so much to bridge the gap between you and the rest of the world, as to send out a bottle on the waves to what might be a fellow outcast who might find it and be comforted, and even bring comfort to the original writer. So that's poor dear Swift, who had relations with a couple of women about which we are not entirely clear. I mean, in the 18th century, only one person managed in the in the history of English letters and the history of English culture, and that person lived actually in the previous century, a man called Samuel Pepys, who kept a diary, and I hope I'll manage to finish my sentence in the end. He kept a diary in which he annotated his sexual life in code, but he was one of the first great diary keepers. He noted everything down. Nobody did in those days. People were too modest to think that what they had for lunch might be of any importance to anybody other than themselves. But Pepys seemed to have anticipated the 20th century, during which Freud lived, and brought to us a sense of the importance of ourselves, which was coming in the 19th century, and assisted in the evolution of the novel, which is also all about how important we are as individuals rather than as a collectivity. And so Pepys had kept us abreast of his sexual doings in detail, not only with his wife, but the maidservants in his house, and the kind of sex that they enjoyed also is specified in code. So we know a lot about Samuel Pepys's sex life, as we do about his theatre going and many other things, but we don't know 100 years later about exactly what went on between Jonathan Swift and his lady friends, or between Alexander Pope and the two sisters Blunt, spelt Blount, with whom he had an enduring friendship, and whether any more, nobody knows. But of course, it gives great joy to scholars to speculate where there is as little material as possible. This is one of the reasons that Shakespearean scholarship is so fertile, is that scholars will insist that we know nothing about Shakespeare's actual life, which enables them to make themselves important, claiming the contrary. The truth of the matter is we know an immense amount about his daily life, to the point where there's a book, I think it's called 1601, which takes us day by day, week by week, through what Shakespeare did, which we know from many different sources, and the idea on which the whole thesis that Shakespeare himself, the man of Stratford-on-Avon, as he's contemptuously referred to in a Trump-like trope, where you talk about the woman in Michigan when referring to the governor, people refer to the man from Stratford-on-Avon as not having written the works that carry the name William Shakespeare. In fact, we know perfectly well that William Shakespeare did, for reasons so voluminous that unless you want me to devote another 15-minute lecture to that, which, sigh, I will if required, is a totally closed book, but scholars like it to be opened again to reveal things that we had never suspected about the lives of the great. Anyway, good luck in your Swift search, And we'll leave until next week the Swift quiz that I might bring forward. So stay safe, please, and be well. Bye to you both.